My parents sold our home when I turned 18 and abandoned me. Years later, I found love, family, and success in the most unexpected place. I never knew what a real family was supposed to be like until I was 7 years old. My name's Emily, but everyone calls me Em. I grew up thinking that all families were like mine, cold, distant, and devoid of affection. My dad, a successful dentist with his own practice, and my mom, who worked as his nurse, provided for me materially, but that was about it. From as far back as I can remember, hugs and kisses were foreign concepts in our house. My parents never showed any warmth towards me, and I just assumed that's how things were supposed to be. We lived in a nice house, had good food on the table, and I always had clean clothes to wear, but something was missing and I couldn't put my finger on it. Our family didn't socialize much. We rarely had visitors and I never went to other kids' houses. It was just us in our own little bubble. Looking back, I realized how isolated we were, but at the time it seemed normal. Everything changed when I made friends with a girl in my class, Lily. One day, she invited me over to her house after school. I remember walking into her home and feeling like I'd stepped into another world. Lily's mom greeted us at the door with a warm smile. "Hi, sweetie," she said, pulling Lily into a tight hug. "And you must be Em. It's so nice to meet you." Before I knew what was happening, she had wrapped her arms around me too. I froze, not knowing how to react. The hug was nice, warm, comforting. All these new sensations washed over me, and I felt my eyes start to water. As we sat in Lily's living room doing our homework, I couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. Lily's mom would pop in occasionally, asking if we needed anything, ruffling Lily's hair, or giving her a quick peck on the cheek. Each time I felt a pain in my chest. When it was time for me to go home, Lily's mom offered to drive me. As we pulled up to my house, she turned to me with a kind smile. "It was lovely having you over, Em. You're welcome anytime." Then, to my absolute shock, she leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "Good night, sweetie." I stumbled out of the car, my mind reeling. As I walked into my house, I saw my parents sitting in the living room, engrossed in their own activities. My mom was reading a book while my dad was looking over some papers. "I'm home," I said hesitantly. My mom barely glanced up. "Did you finish your homework at Lily's?" "Yes," I replied, then gathered my courage. "Mom, Dad, why don't you ever kiss me goodnight?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mom finally looked up from her book, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "What are you talking about, Emily? We feed you, clothe you, and provide a roof over your head. That should be enough for you." I felt my heart sink. "But that's enough, Emily," my dad interjected, not looking up from his papers. "Go to your room and get ready for bed." That night, as I lay in bed, I realized for the first time that something was wrong in our family. The warmth I had felt in Lily's home was completely absent in mine, and as I drifted off to sleep, I wondered why my parents couldn't love me the way Lily's mom loved her. As I grew older, the stark difference between my family and others became increasingly apparent. By the time I hit my teenage years, I had a clearer understanding of what was wrong. My mother was the root of the problem. Mom had always been a cold woman, seemingly incapable of showing emotion towards anyone, let alone affection. It wasn't just me she treated this way. I noticed she was equally distant with Dad. It was as if she was made of ice, impenetrable and unyielding. I started noticing more and more how burdened they seemed by their parental duties. They'd attend parent-teacher meetings, sure, but their faces always held barely concealed irritation, as if they'd rather be anywhere else. When my 16th birthday rolled around, I had a foolish hope that things might change. Maybe they'd surprise me with a heartfelt gift, or even just a warm hug. Instead, I got a cold dose of reality. "Emily," Mom said over breakfast, her tone as flat as ever, "your father and I need to discuss something with you." Dad cleared his throat. "We wanted to make it clear that you shouldn't expect us to pay for your college education. We're not required to do so. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I stared at them, unable to speak. You're old enough now to start thinking about your future, Mom continued, not noticing or not caring about my shocked expression. If you want to go to college, you'll need to figure out how to pay for it yourself. I nodded numbly, pushing away from the table. Thanks for letting me know, I managed to say before retreating to my room. That day marked a turning point for me. I realized that if I wanted anything in life, I'd have to get it for myself. My parents weren't going to help me. They'd made that crystal clear. After graduating high school, I knew I needed to start earning more money. College seemed like a distant dream, but I was determined to make it happen. That's how I found myself working as a waitress at Sam's Diner, a small local restaurant just a few blocks from our house. Sam, the owner, was a middle-aged man with a perpetual 5'00" shadow and a belly that spoke of too many taste tests in the kitchen. When I applied for the job, he looked me up and down with a grin that made me slightly uncomfortable. Well, he said, stroking his chin. You'll definitely attract customers with those looks, sweetheart. You're hired. 3 months into my new job, my life took another dramatic turn. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was getting ready for my afternoon shift when my parents called me down for breakfast. This was unusual. We rarely ate together, let alone had conversations over meals. As I sat down, I noticed my parents exchanging glances. My mother, her face as impassive as ever, spoke first. Emily, your father and I have some news, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. We've decided to sell the house and move to Europe. The sale will be finalized next month. I waited for them to continue, to tell me about their plans for me, but the silence stretched on. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. So what? What about me? I asked, my voice small. Am I coming with you? My parents exchanged another look, this one tinged with what seemed like annoyance. My father cleared his throat. Emily, you're an adult, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. It's time for you to find your own place to live. We've fulfilled our duty. You're of legal age now, which means you need to figure things out on your own. Anger and disbelief welled inside me. This is my home too, I shouted, standing up so quickly my chair toppled over. You can't just throw me out. My father actually laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent chills down my spine. This house is my property, Em. You have no claim to it. Tears stung my eyes as the full weight of their callousness hit me. Without another word, I ran upstairs and started throwing my belongings into a suitcase. As I was about to leave, my parents stopped me at the door. Show us what's in the suitcase, my mother demanded, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you serious? You think I'm stealing from you? We just want to make sure you're not taking anything valuable, my father said, as if it was the most reasonable request in the world. That was the last straw. Years of pent-up anger and hurt came pouring out of me in a torrent of curse words and accusations. I screamed at them, calling them every nasty name I could think of, telling them they were the worst parents in the world. They didn't even flinch. When I ran out of steam, my mother simply opened the door and gestured for me to leave. With nowhere else to go, I headed to Sam's Diner for my shift, dragging my suitcase behind me. Sam looked up from behind the counter, his eyebrows shooting up when he saw my suitcase. What's going on? I tried to keep it together, I really did, but as soon as he asked, the dam broke. Tears started streaming down my face as I told him everything, how my parents were selling the house, moving to Europe, and had kicked me out without a care in the world. Sam listened, his face growing more concerned with each word. When I finished, he reached out and took my hand. Oh, sweetheart, that's terrible. Listen, I might be able to help you out. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest, but then I saw the look in his eyes, and my stomach dropped. You could stay at my place, he continued, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of my hand, but you'd need to show me how grateful you are. I yanked my hand away, disgust replacing my sadness. Are you kidding me? Sam's face hardened. Fine, have it your way. But If you're not going to take my offer, you can consider yourself fired. I don't need your drama in my diner. I rented a room at a cheap hostel for the night. As I sat on the lumpy bed, I pulled out my phone and opened my parents' social media pages. I'd never paid much attention to them before, but now I scrolled through their friends lists, desperately looking for any relatives who might be willing to help me. One by one, I reached out to them, explaining my situation, and one by one, they turned me down. Some were polite about it, others less so, but the result was the same. No one wanted to take me in. Just when I was about to give up hope, I got a message from someone I'd never met, my mother's aunt, Margaret. She lived in another state, but said she'd be willing to let me stay with her for a while. With no other options, I used the last of my money to buy a bus ticket to Aunt Margaret's town. When I finally arrived, Aunt Margaret was waiting for me at the bus station. She looked a lot like my mother, the same sharp features and steely eyes. "Emily," she said, nodding at me. "Welcome." As we drove to her house, Aunt Margaret laid out the ground rules. "You can stay in the spare room. I expect you to keep it clean and help out around the house. And you'll need to find a job. I'm not running a charity here." The next few weeks fell into a routine. I found a job at a local cafe, worked long hours, and spent my free time cleaning Aunt Margaret's house and cooking meals. She was always polite but distant, watching me with a weariness I couldn't understand. One evening, as I was dusting the living room, my eyes fell on a framed photograph I hadn't noticed before. It showed a young man with a bright smile, his arm around a younger version of Aunt Margaret. "Aunt Margaret," I called out. "Who's this in the photo?" I heard a sharp intake of breath behind me. When I turned around, I saw something I never expected. Tears in Aunt Margaret's eyes. That's my son," she said, her voice cracking. "He died in a car accident 10 years ago." I put down the duster and did something I'd never done before. I hugged her. To my surprise, she hugged me back, her body shaking with silent sobs. When we finally pulled apart, Aunt Margaret looked at me with wonder. "You know, I always thought you'd be just like your mother, cold and unfeeling." I shook my head, feeling my own tears welling up. "And I thought you were just like her too." I guess we were both wrong. As the days passed, Aunt Margaret and I grew closer. The warmth I'd always craved from my parents, I found in her. We'd spend evenings talking, sharing stories, and slowly healing the wounds of our pasts. For the first time in my life, I felt truly loved and accepted. One evening, about 2 months after I'd arrived, Aunt Margaret sat me down with a serious look on her face. My heart skipped a beat, fearing the worst. Was she going to ask me to leave? "Emily," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I want to talk to you about something important. When my son died, I set aside money for his college education. It's been sitting in an account for years now, and, well, I've been thinking." She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I want you to have it for your education." I stared at her, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "What?" But that's your son's money." "I can't. You can and you will," Aunt Margaret said firmly. "My boy would have wanted it to be used for something good. And you, Emily, you deserve a chance at a better life." Without hesitation, I threw my arms around her, sobbing into her shoulder. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." And just like that, my life changed again. I enrolled in the local college as a business major, determined to make Aunt Margaret proud. We settled into a new routine. I'd go to classes during the day, work part-time at the cafe in the evenings, and spend my nights studying at the kitchen table while Aunt Margaret knitted in her favorite armchair. For 2 years, life was better than good, actually. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. I had a loving family, I was getting an education, and I felt like I was finally on the path to a bright future. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when there was a knock at the door. I was home alone, working on a paper for my marketing class. Assuming it was a package delivery, I opened the door without a second thought. The woman standing on the porch made my blood run cold. Her hair was grayer, her face more lined, but there was no mistaking those cold, hard eyes. "Hello, Emily," my mother said, her voice as emotionless as ever. I gripped the doorframe, my knees suddenly weak. "Mom? What are you doing here?" She looked past me into the house, her lips pursed. "I need to speak with Margaret." "Is she home?" I shook my head, still in shock. "She's out running errands. She'll be back soon." My mother nodded curtly. "I'll wait then." Before I could protest, she brushed past me into the house. I closed the door, my mind racing. What was she doing here after 2 years of silence? Why now? As we sat in uncomfortable silence in the living room, I took a good look at my mother. She wasn't the well-put-together woman I remembered. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair unkempt. There was a desperation in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I broke the silence. "Why are you here, Mom?" She met my gaze, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of emotion, but it was gone so quickly. I might have imagined it. "I need help," she said flatly. "Your father and I are no longer together. We moved to Italy as planned. Your father, he met someone else, a younger woman. He left me for her." Before I could respond, we heard the front door open. Aunt Margaret walked in, her arms full of grocery bags. When she saw my mother, she froze. "Clara," Aunt Margaret said, her voice clipped. "What brings you here after all this time?" My mother straightened her posture, trying to regain some of her old authority. "Margaret, the first need your help. I've fallen on hard times." Aunt Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Oh! And what about your comfortable life in Italy?" "Things didn't work out as planned," my mother replied, her voice tight. "Thomas left me for another woman. I have nowhere else to go." "You're my only option, Margaret." Aunt Margaret let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, that's rich coming from you, Clara. Do you remember when I needed your help? When I lost my son and couldn't even afford a proper funeral? Where were you then?" I saw my mother flinch, but she quickly regained her composure. "That was different." "Different?" Aunt Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "How was it different? Because it wasn't you who needed help?" The tension in the room was unbearable. I felt like I should say something, do something, but I was frozen in place, watching this family drama unfold. My mother's eyes suddenly locked onto me. "Em," she said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation, "you owe me. I'm your mother." I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "I owe you? You kicked me out without a second thought. You told me I was on my own, and now you have the nerve to say I owe you?" "I raised you," my mother began, but I cut her off. "You provided the bare minimum?" I spat out. "Food, clothes, a roof over my head, but you never gave me what I really needed. Love, support, affection. You were cold and distant my entire life, and when I needed you most, you threw me out like I was nothing." My mother's face paled. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't care. "And now you come here expecting help, expecting me to forget everything you've done, or rather, everything you didn't do. Well, guess what, Mom? I'm doing just fine without you. I found someone who actually cares about me, who supports me, who loves me. I don't need you anymore." The room fell silent after my outburst. Aunt Margaret stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I think it's time for you to leave, Clara," she said firmly. My mother looked between us, realization dawning on her face. Without another word, she stood up and walked to the door. As the door closed behind her, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I turned to Aunt Margaret, who pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking my hair. "You stood up for yourself. You're stronger than you know." As I cried into her shoulder, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and, strangely, a sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I had confronted my mother and spoken my truth. It hurt, but it also felt like the beginning of healing. About a week after the incident, I was walking across campus when I overheard a group of my classmates whispering and glancing in my direction. As I got closer, I caught snippets of their conversation. "That's her, the one whose mother. Can you believe she'd abandoned her own mom?" My stomach dropped. How did they know about what happened? I quickened my pace, my cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. It didn't take long to figure out what was going on. My mother had taken up residence in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and had started showing up at the college, telling anyone who would listen about how her ungrateful daughter had abandoned her in her time of need. For days, she sat on a bench near the main entrance, accosting students and staff alike with her tale of woe. My classmates began to whisper behind my back, some giving me looks of pity, others of judgment. I tried to ignore it to focus on my studies, but it was hard. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling class where I could feel everyone's eyes on me, I broke down and told Aunt Margaret everything. The next day, with Aunt Margaret by my side for moral support, I approached a group of my classmates who were huddled near the campus coffee shop. I took a deep breath and spoke up. "Hey guys, I need to talk to you about something about my mother." They turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and weariness. And so I began to talk. I told them everything about my childhood in a cold, loveless home, about being kicked out the moment I turned 18, about struggling to survive on my own until Aunt Margaret took me in. As I spoke, I saw their expressions change from skepticism to shock, and finally to understanding. By the time I finished, there were tears in more than a few eyes. One of my classmates, Sophie, stepped forward and hugged me. I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Your mom, she made it sound so different." Word spread quickly after that. My classmates, now armed with the truth, became my fiercest defenders. When my mother tried to approach them with her tales of abandonment, they shut her down. The college security, alerted to the situation, began escorting her off campus whenever she showed up. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that my mother had given up and left town. She had returned to our hometown, taking a job as a nurse at the local clinic and renting a small apartment. I felt relieved and calm. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm after the tumultuous events with my mother. I found my footing again and threw myself back into my studies with renewed determination. My grades improved, and I was on track to graduate with honors. One ordinary afternoon, as I was reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, my phone buzzed with a notification, a message from an unexpected sender, my father. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, curiosity and apprehension mingling in my chest. The message read, "Emily, I hope this finds you well. I'm reaching out because I have a proposition for you. I've remarried in Italy and have a young son now. We could use some help with childcare. Would you consider coming to stay with us? You could be a nanny for your half-brother. I know you probably don't have many prospects there, so this could be a great opportunity for you." I stared at the screen, a mixture of disbelief and amusement washing over me. After years of silence, this was what he had to offer: a job as an unpaid nanny for a half-brother I'd never met? The audacity was almost comical. Without hesitation, I typed a single word in response. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again. My father, clearly taken aback by my curt reply, began asking questions. Where was I living? How was I supporting myself? What was I doing with my life? A mischievous smile played on my lips as I scrolled through my photo gallery. I selected a picture of myself on campus, beaming in front of the business school building, and another of me laughing in Aunt Margaret's cozy kitchen. I sent these images without comment. The response was immediate. Message after message flooded in, each more frantic than the last. How had I managed to go to college? Where was I getting the money? Whose house did I live in? I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, then typed out one final message. That's none of your business. With a sense of finality, I blocked his number. Months passed, and before I knew it, graduation day arrived. As I stood in line, waiting to receive my diploma, my eyes scanned the audience. There, in the third row, sat Aunt Margaret, her face glowing with pride. She clapped the loudest when my name was called, and I couldn't help but beam as I crossed the stage. Looking at Aunt Margaret, the first made a silent vow. I would build a life that would make her proud. I would take the love and support she had given me and pay it forward. I would show her and the world that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice, love, and commitment.